Okay, let's unpack this. We're about to do a deep dive into the um, really complex and, let's be honest, often contentious world of Islamic sexual ethics.
And our sources for this are fascinating. We're drawing on scholarly feminist reflections that are, critically engaging with the very foundations of the tradition.
We're talking about the Quran, the Hadith, and the centuries of classical jurisprudence built on top of them.
Right. And our mission today is pretty sharp and focused. We want to give you a thorough but quick understanding of this enormous tension that's at play.
Attention between what, exactly?
Well, on one side, you've got the detailed codified rules. It's what the sources call textual Islam, which is basically the male elite legal heritage.
And it was all developed in what's been described as an alien climate of ideas,
Yep.
right? I mean, a world very different from today.
Exactly.
Yep.
And on the other side, you have contemporary ethical standards, which are largely rooted in this ideal of universal gender justice.
So the conflict is, how do you reconcile those two things? How do you square that circle? How do we find justice in a legal tradition that, well, often codified rules that were pretty patriarchal and gender differentiated?
It's not easy. It requires a really specific approach, an exercise of the historical imagination that is sympathetic as well as critical.
Meaning you can't just write off the classical jurists as, evil or stupid.
Not at all. We have to understand the specific legal, social, and economic world they were living in. Only then can we properly evaluate their work for today.
So let's start at the very beginning with the foundational structure of classical marriage, because it was explicitly transactional.
Very much so. It established a clear legal exchange, almost like a balance sheet.
Hmm.
The man offers support and protection. That's nafaka.
And in exchange, he receives the wife's, and this is a quote, sexual, reproductive, and housekeeping services.
That contractual nature is immediately visible in the financial links. Take the mar or dower.
That's the property transfer paid to the wife at the time of marriage.
Right. And today, many Muslims emphasize its positive role, as an economic safety net for the woman, financial protection.
But if you dig into the classical jurists, the link was, well, it was much more visceral, a lot less palatable to our modern ears.
That's putting it mildly. Some really influential jurists, like al-Shafi'i, used extremely graphic language. He referred to the dower as the vulva's price, thaman al-Buddha.
Wow, the vulva's price.
It's stark. And that phrase, it fundamentally tied the financial exchange directly to legitimate sexual access. If the mar is the price, then what's being purchased is the right to that access.
And I'm guessing that clarity of purpose carried over into the definition of spousal support, or nafaka,
It did.
because I think a lot of Muslims today, they would assume nafaka, the husband providing for the wife, is, payment for her being a homemaker.
For cooking, raising children, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Is that how the classical text saw it?
No, not primarily. While those duties were often, implied, the classical texts are very clear that the husband maintained his wife primarily in exchange for her sexual availability to him.
So it was an explicit quid pro quo.
Very explicit. If she refused to transfer that benefit, his obligation to provide nafaka could actually be suspended. It was all centered on intimacy.
And that transactional nature, it leads right to a pretty strong double standard when it comes to sexual duties, which you see all over the Hadith literature.
Right. It establishes the wife's sexual duty as something that's enforceable, under pain of religious sanction.
And you find those specific Hadith reports asserting really dire consequences for women who refuse their husbands.
Famously, yes, the one stating, if a man invites his wife to sleep with her and she refuses to come to him, then the angels send their curses on her till morning. That places immense pressure on the wife.
Immense. So what about the other side? The husband's equivalent duty. Does the wife have a right to demand sexual attention?
Well, the husband has what's called an unrestricted right to sex, basically whenever he desires. There are some minor caveats against, causing physical harm or interfering with her prayers.
But the wife's right.
Her right is contingent. It's often secondary. There's one juristic view that puts the power imbalance so starkly. It says, after the first time, intercourse is his right, not her right.
So the first time validates the marriage, but after that, the right belongs exclusively to him as the financial provider.
Precisely. That distinction between an unrestricted right for one and a conditional duty for the other, that's central to the whole historical power dynamic.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting. We have to talk about the underlying conceptual vocabulary of the law, because that's arguably the deepest problem for contemporary Muslims.
We need to discuss the legal concept of milk.
Milk, M-I-L-K.
This is the absolute pivot point. Milk is usually translated as ownership, but in classical law, it's more like control or legal possession.
And this wasn't just some abstract idea.
Not at all. Classical legal works routinely drew these profound analogies between marriage and slavery, because both were seen as forms of milk that granted sexual access.
So how deeply did this concept of milk permeate the legal structure? I mean, was it just a metaphor, or did it actually affect things like, say, divorce?
Oh, it affected everything. The husband's power of unilateral, repudiation or divorce, it derived directly from his milk over the marriage tie.
His power to dissolve the marriage.
Was seen as directly parallel to a master's power of manumission, itu, which resulted from his ownership of a slave. In both cases, the power rested solely with the man who possessed the milk.
And this conceptualization also explained the other major category of permissible sex, the one the Quran refers to as sexual access to what their right hands possess.
Exactly. This referred to concubines, female slaves. And the jurists were clear, this category was totally distinct from wives. It permitted men an unlimited number of concubines.
So it just cemented this hierarchical way of thinking where sexual access was dictated entirely by legal control.
Whether through the marriage contract or through actual physical ownership.
And this is where the modern conflict becomes, well, unavoidable. The foundational laws were built assuming slavery was permissible. But now slavery has been globally outlawed. I think Saudi Arabia abolished it in 1962.
So the entire conceptual framework is under threat. That's what's called the hierarchical residue. The old legal texts relied so heavily on milk to determine who had control, who owed duties, who had rights.
So if the system that permitted one form of milk slavery is gone, how can laws designed within that exact same framework, like unilateral talaq, still apply today?
It's the central question. It forces contemporary scholars to address the core problem, the concept of ownership over intimacy itself.
Let's dive deeper into divorce, because that's where this conflict between legal privilege and religious morality plays out in the most dramatic way.
And this power structure, it can lead to extreme, even life-threatening moral dilemmas. The sources present this devastating anecdote, one that's often used to test the limits of the law. It involves a triple divorced wife.
Okay, walk us through this scenario. What is her legal bind?
So she is absolutely certain in her own heart and mind that her husband has pronounced talaq 3 times.
Which, under classical law, renders her absolutely and irrevocably divorced from him.
Correct. For her, having sexual relations with him now would be zina, illicit sex, a major sin.
But the husband denies it. He denies having said the 3 divorces.
He denies it. And here's the crux of the problem. In some legal schools, a wife's testimony about the divorce is considered inadmissible, or at least it's not sufficient without male witnesses.
So legally, in the eyes of the state, the marriage is still intact.
It is, because his testimony or his position of power just overrides hers.
So she is trapped.
Right.
Religiously, she believes he is committing rape every single night, but legally, he is still her husband. What choice does she actually have?
The choice is one of life and death. Her religious, moral obligation is to defend herself against this coerced sex, even to the point of killing her would-be rapist. That's her duty to God.
But if she follows that religious duty, she would then be subject to temporal punishment, state punishment, for assault or murder.
Because she can't legally prove the divorce ever happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She's trapped between her religious conscience and the state's enforceable law.
That's a chilling illustration.
It is. It shows a profound chasm. The legal system, built on the husband's unilateral privilege, can completely override a deeply held moral conviction, and it leaves the woman with no legal way to enforce her religious rights.
It really shows how a procedural rule like who can testify and what counts as proof can just negate morality.
Right. It shows that when power is unilaterally vested in one party, the law itself can become the mechanism for a kind of legalized immorality, regardless of an individual's internal conviction.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the broader ethical challenge of illicit sex and consent. We define zina as any consensual sex outside of marriage or concubinage.
And the classical punishments are, of course, severe. Stoning or flogging.
But let's talk about the criteria for proof. The criteria are almost impossible to meet. You need 4 male adult Muslim eyewitnesses to the actual act of penetration. That level of stringency means prosecuting zina is exceedingly rare. And on top of that, if you bring an unsupported accusation, that's called quad, you are punished almost as severely as the zina offender yourself. 80 lashes.
So the law is actually designed to actively discourage public prosecution.
Precisely. This creates the social norm that's often described as the don't ask, don't tell ethos. The system prioritizes covering sins, not exposing them.
The goal is to maintain the appearance of social order.
To prevent fitna, or chaos, covering up one's own faults or the faults of others is understood as a vital duty for a believer.
But this historical ethos is clashing head-on with modern ethical shifts, especially around consent.
It truly is. This is where the historical framework becomes, and I quote, unintelligible to a lot of contemporary Muslims. Think about it. Historically, sex with a slave, which was often coerced by modern standards, was legally preferred. It was lawful because of milk.
Meanwhile, two consenting adults having sex outside of a legal contract was zina and potentially punishable by death.
The morality of the legal system privileged legal ownership over mutual consent.
That's the key takeaway.
It is. For modern thinkers, if an act involves consent, even without a legal contract, it should have a higher moral standing than an act involving coercion, even if that coercion was legally justified through ownership.
And this tension, it must also extend to same-sex intimacy.
Absolutely. The classical texts, they never dealt with modern concepts of sexual orientation or identity. They dealt with specific acts, liwat for men, musahakat al-nisa for women.
And the prohibitions are anchored in the idea that male and female are created to be complementary mates.
Exactly. So to legitimize same-sex intimacy challenges the very purpose of creation as defined in those texts.
So does the don't ask, don't tell ethos apply here too?
For some, it's an appealing status quo. It avoids direct confrontation. But for others, that avoidance is a deep hypocrisy that violates other principles, like justice and honesty. They argue that if the goal is true gender justice, then that justice can't just stop with heterosexual relationships.
Finally, let's look at what might be the ultimate test case for the whole tradition. The reported actions of the Prophet Muhammad himself, the Uswa Hasana, the perfect model.
What happens when those reported actions clash severely with modern universal ethical standards?
This brings us to the most controversial report, the Hadith, about Aisha's age. And this is found in Sahih Bukhari.
Which, for Sunnis, is one of the two most authentic collections of prophetic narrations. It's second only to the Quran itself.
And what does that highly authentic report state?
It states that the Prophet Muhammad married Aisha when she was 6 years old and consummated the marriage when she was 9.
For modern Muslims, this report, because of its high legal standing, it presents a profound dilemma.
A profound dilemma, especially in a global climate where child marriage is seen as abuse and is often illegal. It's deeply uncomfortable and highly scrutinized.
So how do modern authors deal with it?
Well, the response takes a few forms. Some try to reject the specific reports entirely, arguing they're unreliable despite being in Bukhari. Others argue that the rules for the Prophet were specific to him, that he was an exception.
But what does the philosophical weight of this dilemma really force a believer to confront?
It forces the Muslim community to confront the most profound question in ethics, which our source material just captures perfectly. Is something good because God says so? Or does God say it is good because it is inherently so?
Right. And if you believe the former, that morality is just divine command, then you have to accept the report. You have to argue that 9 was ethically acceptable because the Prophet did it.
Correct. But if you accept the latter, the ethical justice standard, then you are obligated to use your own conscience, your own judgment, to discern injustice. And that means you must criticize or depart from a seemingly clear historical ruling if it violates a higher ethical ideal.
The same ethical ideal that dictates the rejection of slavery.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? What does this intellectual journey mean for the modern Muslim community trying to create a just ethics of sex?
It means that you need constructive and critical engagement with the whole tradition. You have to recognize that the classical jurist law was not divine revelation. It was already subjected to acts of human interpretation influenced by their time and place.
Their answers were human answers, and therefore they are subject to human critique today.
Precisely. And if Muslims truly want systematic change, like, say, divorcing sexual intimacy from financial support so that sex becomes a fully mutual right, not a duty owed to the provider, it's not enough just to argue against old rules one by one.
You have to reform the whole structure.
Yes. The conceptual structure of marriage itself has to be fundamentally reformed. It has to move entirely away from the paradigm of milk and ownership. That's the heavy lift.
And this leads us right back to that core philosophical choice. If Muslims are willing to set aside the literal meaning of sources on issues like slavery because it clashes with universal justice, and if they're willing to question reports as authentic as the one about Aisha's age.
Then how do we consistently determine which other seemingly clear Quranic statements or highly codified rules, like the husband's exclusive power of talaq or the prohibition on Muslim women marrying non-Muslim men, must also be reevaluated and reformed to achieve the highest ethical aspirations of the Islamic tradition?
That burden of ethical consistency.
That is the moral responsibility placed squarely on believers today.